All right, what is up? Welcome back in GC Live. Hope everybody had a great Christmas, great holiday, great everything. Chris and I were just talking about how much we missed y'all. We are back for one final preview before South Carolina versus Illinois. I feel like bowl games, Chris, it's always kind of interesting. You feel like you're a long way away from the game, and then it just kind of sneaks up on you a little bit. So we're going to knock out this one final preview show, give some thoughts on the game. But first, got to tell you about our buddy Clint Hammond, CMG Home Loans, ClintHammond.com, 803-422-6797, NMLS number 71597. If you're in the market for a new home in the new year, it is very simple. Just hit up Clint. He's going to walk you through everything in terms of a mortgage, what different options you may have. Obviously, that's a big process for anyone out there. So if you're a first-time home buyer or an experienced veteran in that world, hit up Clint. Great guy, great Gamecock, and fantastic at what he does. All right, Chris. So, and by the way, we have several other ads we got to get out of the way. So you'll hear from some of our other sponsors throughout the show. But I do want to go ahead and dive into the game a bit. And, Chris, I was starting to kind of go through the process of, all right, what do people need to know about this team? And the first one, and this is one, if you've turned on Illinois at all this year, to me, was Luke Altmaier, their quarterback. Like, all right, this kid is a good football player. Like, honestly, I think he gets a little bit just overshadowed in that conference by all the talk about, Dylan Gabriel, Will Howard, maybe was not the biggest name quarterback coming into this season, but in my opinion is right up there with those guys in terms of just the ability. We hear coaches talk about arm talent. He can spin it, all those things, spreading the ball around, getting it to his playmakers. This kid can do that. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about him as we go. My next question was like, all right, what other than Luke Altmaier do people need to know about Illinois? And as I kind of dove into the stats a little bit, watched a couple of their games, to me, what stood out is as you kind of go through their stats, there's not one just thing that I think they do better than anybody else. But then I don't know if there's a fatal flaw on this team either. Like, to me, they are incredibly balanced. And you start going through, total offense, total defense, run offense, run defense, pass offense. And they're kind of in that middle but upper tier within the other Big Ten teams in almost every category. Like there's no real one that you just sort of highlight. The one thing I did highlight, and I'll steal your thunder because it's your favorite topic, is that they do get turnovers. And so they're kind of, if you look at turnover margin, if you look at overall takeaways, that's one I always look at. It just how much do you get the football off your opponent? And right now they have, let's see, they're fifth in the Big Ten, and we know that's a massive conference. So fifth in the Big Ten, that's an 18-team league at this point, with 19 takeaways from their opponents. So that's 12 interceptions gained and 7 fumbles gained this year. And then also, they really do not turn the football over a ton either. They're seventh in the conference in that area. But I think just a good, balanced football team. We'll get to our predictions at the end. Man, this does not feel like two teams that are double digits points separated from them when I look at this Illinois team. Like I think we got a pretty good game potentially on our hands.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you make a good point about how balanced they are and how, a lot of times you'll look at a team, you say, this team can't do this particular thing, or they're just overly good in this one area, not so good in others. It has been a team that just looks like a good team, right? From top to bottom. They've had some ups and downs this year, as South Carolina has, but you dive into their schedule. So let's go kind of high level and then take it down a little bit more micro into what's happened for them this season. They're 9-3. And their 3 losses are 2 of them, Wes, to teams that are in the college football playoff right now. They lost to Penn State. They've lost to Oregon. And then they lost in, I believe, 8-point game to Minnesota, a Minnesota team that solid team, not a great team, obviously. On the other hand, you've got the fact that they, went to overtime with Purdue, who's horrible. And they did win the game, right? But they won by 1 against Purdue. They had another very, very close call to Rutgers, in which they had missed a 58-yard field goal. Basically would have lost the game, but Greg Schiano from Rutgers had called timeout. So then they come back on the field and say, let's go for this thing. And they score on 4th down, a touchdown to win the football game. So this is a team that, has not been, Wes, dominant. This is a team that is battle tested because they played some of the best out of the Big Ten, but their record is what their record is. They're 9-3. And I think they've been quite good. I have one thought here, and I want to get more into Altmaier and a few statistics from him this season, because he is kind of the straw that stirs the drink. I agree with you. There's been a lot of focus on South Carolina's opt-outs. And Wes, compared to what it could be, given how many NFL draft guys that South Carolina has after this season, this could have been a team that walked into a bowl game decimated, and they're not. And so credit to Shane Beamer, his staff, the players, for holding things together and having lots of guys that are coming back and playing. And that's not any slight towards Rocket Sanders or Kyle Kennard for sitting out, just saying that says something, right? And those are losses that are significant, and we'll cover. Kyle Kennard, best defensive player in the country, according to at least one award, right? So that's significant. But Illinois has done well with opt-outs. Is theirs even more significant because it's Pat Bryant. It's their leading receiver. We had a comment here. TR Gaming brought him up. Quarterback Luke Altmaier and Pat Bryant stood out. Well, Pat Bryant's not playing in this game. He's their leading receiver in terms of receptions, in terms of receiving yards, and Wes, by far their biggest play guy. I think he had that game-winning touchdown against Rutgers.
He did.
18 yards per reception, 10 touchdowns through the air. Their next highest receiver, just 3. So this is a guy that's been the guy for them in terms of receiving yards and just making big plays through the air. It's hard to say that's even more significant than South Carolina, like losing Kyle Kennard. That sounds like a mouthful, right? But I do think that's a pretty big loss for them, given the volume of the offense that he was involved with.
Yeah, and I agree, man. Like that, I'll be curious to see where that guy goes drafted, because how highly he goes, because he is one of those. And like I said, I really had not watched any of Illinois this year. When I started watching them, it was completely blind, other than knowing who Luke Altmaier was. And he's one of those guys, how sometimes, or most of the time, especially an SEC team, I'm like, all right, who are their playmakers? And then, so if you start watching a few games, you are dialed in to, let me watch number 22 on defense. Let me watch number 82 on off. Like, you're already focused on a particular guy. The thing about Bryant, I went in watching them blind, and I'm like, wait, who is this guy?
Right.
And then I went to the Google machine and I typed in Pat Bryant playing bowl game. And you know what I'm saying? Like, I was like, because it was just like I was like, this guy's different. And he did have that game winning play against Rutgers, and it was a grown man play where he just says, I'm just gonna go make a play for my guys, kind of like Rocket did against Missouri. And so but both teams, I feel like, I think both teams are highly motivated. Both teams want to play. This is not one of those bowls where it's just like a skeleton of your team on either side. And both teams are missing a guy or two that they're like, hey, we'd like to have that guy. But you do wonder, and they're probably saying, hey, this is an opportunity for our other wide receivers to step up and show they can play. South Carolina, to me, as we sort of let's dive into the opt-outs a little bit. And Rocket not playing, I feel like that's one of those things. If you didn't have Rocket Sanders for like a season, like you were just like, hey, Rocket's not on this team anymore, that's massive, right? Like that is
Right.
that's going to hurt you over time for one game, especially with it being a bowl game. I think this is an opportunity. Like this is something to me where I'm excited to see what these other running backs do. I thought, first of all, Attaway looked as explosive and productive as he has all year against Clemson. But, and in anybody, though, let's be honest, you always want to see what can the young guys do because you haven't gotten to see them yet. So what can a Juwan Howell do? What can a Matt Fuller do? To me, that might be one of the 2 or 3 best storylines in this game, because these bowl games at this point are like, do you want to get Juju McDowell a few carries just because he's a veteran guy? Like bowl games are kind of a little bit of a one last sort of victory march, like one last take a lap for your older guys, but also it is a preview. It is a showcase for your young guys. And so Juwan Howell, Matt Fuller, 2 guys we have not seen a lot of this year, but 2 guys that are going to be, I would say, leaned on potentially a lot next year. That's intriguing to me. What do we learn about them? And Chris, do you even, can one game, even if one of those guys we're talking about just goes off, could it even change your thought process in the portal? Like I feel like there's 2 directions Carolina can go in the portal, and some of it's going to just be determined by who can you get. Like we know they try to go get Justice Haynes, and Justice Haynes was more along the lines of, hey, this is an SEC starter, bring him in, 1-to-1 SEC starter. The other direction that position could go, because you don't have enough scholarship guys anyway, like you're going to have to add at that position. The other direction I think you could take it would be, hey, Attaway, Juwan Howell, Matt Fuller, those are kind of our guys. And then you kind of backfill on the other end, and you're more filling like depth potentially, or competition, as opposed to like a Rocket Sanders type. Like I could see that playing out either way, but again, it is going to depend. Like you're not going to turn down, like if somebody hits the portal and they're Rocket Sanders level and they're like, hey, I've always dreamed of living in Columbia. Like you're not going to say no, but
right.
It could change the way I think about that position a little bit, depending on how those guys perform.
Well, and you got to figure they've gotten a look all bowl practice season, because it's not just the game, right? You don't just roll up to Orlando and say, hey, let's play a football game. There is prep involved. And so the coaches have gotten a look throughout bowl practice season at those younger guys, right? And we've gotten a little bit of an in-game look at Howell this season. Not a lot, but Wes, some of the carries that he's had, you go, ooh, okay. You got to put it in its proper context, right? Almost like, to a lesser degree, what we saw with Sellers last year. Sellers making some eye-popping plays, and you got to remember, okay, touchdown throw against Furman, run late against Vandy, but like you look at the athleticism, I think it's in some ways similar with Howell. You go, man, that's a big kid. Look at that move he made. Look at his run, right? So I do agree. It can maybe, if one of those guys, or heck, maybe both, if they had a big game, could it validate maybe if the staff has felt good this offseason? Could it lessen the need, I guess you could say, to, we've got to go out and land a Rocket Sanders-esque type guy in the portal? Maybe so. Like you said, unless one of those guys just pops up. My question in this game, if you go to the depth chart, which, probably doesn't mean a ton, Wes, it means something. Attaway and McDowell, the 2 seniors, and Attaway can come back and is, my understanding, planning on coming back next year. Those 2 guys are listed as co-starters, as oars, and that makes sense. You don't get 4 running backs tons of carries each in a game, right? So I'm very curious of how this plays out. You mentioned, hey, get Juju a few carries. Attaway, you got to figure he's going to be out there a lot early. But how much do we see those other two young guys? Mike Shula has said, hey, it's going to be by committee, but there's a hot hand element to it. So let's say you put in Howell and he starts having some big runs. Or let's say Attaway's first guy out there and he looks like he did in the Clemson game that you alluded to earlier. You might say, we're going to ride Oscar Attaway because he looks the best right now. Very fast, kind of little storyline within the game. I'm very curious to see how that goes.
Yeah, and can you potentially get guys a little bit more involved in a bowl game than like just how do they play it? You know, is it hey, we're just here to win the game, period, or is it we're here to win the game and learn a little bit more about maybe our future team in the process? And you know, I think the other thing there is, and sometimes people forget this one after a game to say, hey, why didn't this guy get any carries? Why didn't this guy get an opportunity? You have to have success in order to stay on the field, and then you can get everybody involved. You know, like you if you're going 3 and out, you can't get anyone involved. If you're moving the football, if you're scoring touchdowns, if you are having time of possession or total plays, that gives you those opportunities to mix in different players and rotate them in. You know, maybe to me, maybe you get Juju a little bit more involved in some kind of gadgetry type stuff, and maybe a little slot, maybe a little, you know, hey, let's get him the ball on a reverse at some point. Kind of, we've seen them do that at times, certain games. They'll say, hey, we're going to use Juju in very specific, very deliberate ways. And so I wonder if maybe you do that. I would imagine Attaway gets the start in the game at true running back. We'll see. And then you start to mix in the other guys. But especially this thing starts to get to the second half. I think that's when you say, all right, give Dwarren Howell a drive and let's see what happens. Give Matt Fuller a drive and let's see what happens. And you do want to use this, I think, as a learning experience from both directions of that. I think a learning experience for the players. We always talk about how much experience matters, but also a learning experience for your staff. And hey, what do I learn about my guy when he's actually out there against another opponent? But I mean, Dwarren Howell, there's a nice mix here in terms of skill set. But then you look at Matt Fuller too. He might be one of the just bigger bodied running backs South Carolina has had in a while. Just the way he's built. Like you hear people talk about frame and build and stuff like that. This is a huge kid, very muscular. And I'm just interested to see what we learn about those guys. Before we move any further, by the way, if you're still thinking about last second trip to the game, you got a little bit of time, but not much time. But if you decide you want to go, hit up our friends at Game Time. Told you about them all season long. GameTime.co or Game Time app. Of course, if you love live events, it's a great way to finish off your year at this bowl game. I'm down here with my wife as well. And there's lots of great features on the Game Time app. Game Time Picks is one of my favorites because it's going to curate the sort of best deals. But as I always tell everybody, all-in pricing, just go ahead and toggle that on as well. No surprise fees at checkout. Nobody likes to go think you're buying a ticket at a certain rate and then the fees get added and it's way higher than you thought. Go ahead, toggle that thing on. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code OWN3. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's OWN3, $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply on that. Download Game Time today for that game, other games, concerts, events, all of the above. Chris, I've got an interesting thought, I feel like, on Luke Altmaier. Statistically, the guy has not thrown many picks. I dive into that a little bit. And PFF, turnover-worthy plays, doesn't really back me up on this. So maybe I'm being caught by a small sample size. The games I saw, though, there were some balls in danger where I'm going, that was not an interception. But in a different world, it could have been. A slightly quicker defensive back, a slightly longer defensive back, that's maybe a pick. what PFF does, sort of flashing red light for me here, his fumble grade, which is basically how well you're taking care of the football, when you get hit, not when you're throwing, 25.6 for the season. So he has, and that one will, on PFF's side, it will ding you whether the other team recovers the ball or not. So, it's a fumble regardless in terms of that grade. Very low fumble grade. And I look at what Penn State did to him, which would have been, I'm looking through this, I guess probably the best defense they would have played this year. 33.4 overall grade from PFF in that game. Just 185 passing yards on 26 dropbacks. Didn't have anything down the field in that game. Like that, Altmaier's a very good player, so I'm not saying he's not. He may just light it up tomorrow. But if Carolina gets that pressure on him that we've seen them do to so many teams this year, I do think there is a world where maybe you can kind of bring him back down to earth quite a bit potentially. And some of that's going to be determined by, as we get to the other opt-out, who steps up with the absence of Kyle Kennard. I think Dylan Stewart, we know, will be starting at one spot. Brian Thomas Jr. at the other? Is that where your head is at for this, Chris?
That's what I was going to bring up. Mike Uva polled Gamecock Nation on Twitter about which player they were looking forward to seeing the most in the bowl game, and the man himself, Kyle Kennard, weighed in by saying Brian Thomas Jr. So, Thomas Jr. last year, kind of a co-starter, coming into this year, thought of the same, and then, of course, Stewart and Kennard just kind of took over, right? So, yeah, I think Thomas Jr. is the guy. That's where my head goes in terms of if you're looking for a guy, not just starting, Wes, like not just who's out there first, but who has a chance to make a big impact opposite Dylan Stewart. That is where my head would go. You also factor in Carolina's interior defensive line, which it looks like they're going to have all those guys, and you've got some strong pass rushers there too. So, look, I'm not minimizing Kennard's loss because it is significant, but it's not like you're a complete one-trick pony in terms of rushing the passer. That is going to be a critical part of this. A couple more things on Altmaier, Wes. I don't mean to hijack what you're saying here, but it's not going to win us any prizes to say when Altmaier's good, they win. When he struggled, right? He's the quarterback, most important position on the field. But you do look at some of the games that they've struggled in or lost. Two things. Number one, the picks. Number two, the sacks. So Altmaier's only thrown 5 interceptions. And as you pointed out on your film study, could have been more, right? But just 5 picks. 2 of them were against Northwestern. They won, not in incredibly impressive fashion, but they did win. He did throw 2 against Oregon, and he threw 1 against Penn State. They lost both of those games. The other thing is the sack totals. Altmaier's a guy who can run. He's mobile. He's crafty, so he can get himself out of trouble. But, Wes, they gave up 7 sacks to Penn State. They gave up 5 sacks to Purdue, won that one by 1, and then 4 sacks each in losses to Minnesota and Oregon. So you start seeing some common themes here. If you can find a way to affect Altmaier, obviously you're going to have a better chance to win. Now, you could just say that right off the top. Affect the quarterback, you're going to win. But you can dive into the stats, and it backs you up. The statistics back up that thought. The good news, I think, for South Carolina, and this isn't to, again, Altmaier, like you said, he may go off tomorrow. He is a very good player. But Carolina's seen some really good quarterbacks this year. And some quarterbacks that have some similarities to him. Illinois has played some really good quarterbacks as well. Dylan Gabriel, Drew Aller. You can go on and on. They played some really good quarterbacks. They're not alone in this, but have they played anybody like Lenora Sellers? I don't think so. And their defensive coordinator, Aaron Henry, said as much this week that, hey, we've seen some good quarterbacks. He's a different kind of guy. And a lot of teams found that out down the stretch that he was different. So affect Altmaier and you've got a chance. And then Illinois, are they going to be able to adequately prepare for what you see in the game against Lenora Sellers?
All right. Hey, before we go further, I got to acknowledge Sheriff over here. He's got some food and energy drink takes. Chris, so that is a Celsius, right, Chris?
We have
non-sponsored Celsius.
Non-sponsored, but hey, I mean, if anybody from Celsius is watching, I mean, we do have a pretty good amount of people that watch this show. Right now, my mom is the sponsor of Celsius. She gave me a whole pack. Shout out to my mom.
Nice Christmas present for mom there.
Kiwi guava. Really good.
Yeah. So. Sheriff says, am I a Red Bull guy? Nah, not a Monster. Right. I funny enough, if I have an energy drink, it's like one of those little mixes. I don't know if anybody drinks these anymore. It was like a multi-level marketing. I don't know, like Advocare. I mean, I've never sold the stuff. Don't get me wrong, but I do like the drink. It's like a little mixed drink thing you put together. If I get a energy drink, that's what I roll with. Mainly just coffee at this point. Let's see. Favorite Cheez-It flavor, Chris? I'm gonna be honest here. I don't even know if I've tried all the different Cheez-It like. Yeah. I like Cheez-Its, like just the plain. Now there's one that's like, isn't there an extra toasty or extra cheesy one maybe? Those are pretty good.
They have the ones that are a little more puffed up, like they have more air in them. They also have, I think, Wes, they've expanded into like, let's put ranch on a Cheez-It type of thing, like ranch flavored Cheez-Its, different shapes. I don't know. I've had some of them. The classics are good.
Just a regular old classic. Yes, Austin. I'm in Orlando. I'm in an Airbnb right now. That's what the background is. Let's see. Somebody asked about Pop-Tarts. I'm gonna be honest. Pop-Tarts don't really do it for me, y'all. I can't tell. I haven't had a Pop-Tart in 15 years, probably.
I would like to know from the people, do you like your Pop-Tarts straight out of the wrapper, or do you toast it?
That's a good question.
It's a really good question. There's an argument for either.
I'm going, if I were to have a Pop-Tart, it would be warmed. Like it would.
Yeah, I think toasting it's better. But you know, the other ones, if you're in a hurry, I had the kids have some Pop-Tarts in the pantry. I've stolen a bite here and there lately, but not something going into the new year, Wes. Cheez-Its and Pop-Tarts, they don't need to be a staple of the diet. That's for sure. Agree.
I used to eat. You ever had a toaster strudel back in the day?
Oh, I was going to bring that up. Those were good.
They used to have chocolate ones. Like when I mean, God knows how much sugar was in those things, but definitely not a New Year staple of your diet either. But the chocolate toaster strudels back in the day, those things were good. Anyway, we'll talk football here. I promise. I just didn't want to ignore Sheriff. He had a lot of food takes there. So
yes, he did.
It is an interactive show. And by the way, appreciate all y'all for hopping on. I know we didn't really promote this one too well. We just hopped on. So appreciate y'all. Lenora Sellers. We're at 30-minute mark. We haven't even hardly talked about him yet, other than what you just said a moment ago. I did notice Illinois down the stretch. They struggled to stop the quarterback run game a little bit. And these were kind of what you would say are like your average college quarterback runners. These were not Lenora Sellers. And, not that they were giving up 150 yards on the ground to the QB, but it was more just like, it's been an issue. And I watched their game against Northwestern, which would have been late in the year, and the announcers were talking about how it had become like a thing, like, hey, they've struggled to stop QB run a little bit here down the stretch. And obviously, I feel like their entire week of practice is probably going to be leading up to this game. What can we do to stop Sellers? What can we do to slow Sellers down? How do we structure our defense? They do play quite a bit of man. The game I watched, they were doing a great job of kind of showing man, but then it would be zone instead and just sort of disguising quite a bit. I don't think you can play man coverage a ton against Lenore Sellers.
Yep.
Like that will get you beat because as we talk about when those DBs get run off and Sellers is such a hang in the pocket, wait for the play to develop. Oh, it's not there. Boom, I'm out of here. And that will get you killed, I feel like. So they're, to me, going to have to lean a little bit more to the zone side of things. But this is a defense, when I watched them, they can do either. They're kind of much like their offense. They're kind of balanced. They don't, to me, Chris, they look pretty talented up front. Like when I just watched them with the eye test, but then statistically, they're not a team that's like upper level in terms of tackles for loss created, sacks, stuff like that. So I think this is a good Illinois defense. Like they look like a good defense. They have a nickel back that is very talented. He pops, he stands off. He was an all Big Ten guy. But for the most part, this isn't a game where you sort of circle and say, hey, this defensive line may just take over, which for most of the year, I feel like when Carolina started to eliminate all the negative plays, all the tackles for loss allowed, and some of that was just Sellers bouncing off people, making people miss, avoiding sacks. That's when the offense, to me, got a little bit better. And so can that continue into this week, into this game, will be interesting.
Yeah, and I go back to the defensive coordinator for Illinois, former NFL defensive back Aaron Henry, and he mentioned, like, hey, we played a lot of good quarterbacks, but this guy Sellers, he's a little different, and he is. I can't imagine being a defensive coordinator at this point. Early in the season was one thing. We can go back and you can just see the growth from Sellers. The hockey stick growth, to use like the economic term, where, game 1 to game 12, like almost unrecognizable, how much better he got. You saw the flashes early, but just got so much better. And so now if you're a defensive coordinator going in, man coverage, like you said, it's not out west, but if you're a heavy man team, now you're thinking about restructuring, because you can cover guys well. You can cover guys down the field. But that was the exact point I was going to bring up. You run your corners man-to-man down the field. You have your safeties helping in coverage. If you don't get Sellers on the ground and contain him in the pocket, he's going to run, and he's going to run a long way on you. Like we saw that several times in the last game South Carolina played against Clemson. You can say, well, we'll spy him. Okay. He'll probably run around, through, or past your spy. We've seen that as well. Really, Sellers, there's been a lot going around. By the way, I'm going to have a mini rant, Wes. There's this thing that opposing fan bases are doing, saying that Sellers can't throw, which shows that you didn't watch any of the games that he played in. But that is, if you're a defensive coordinator, you're sitting there going, we got to keep him in the pocket and make him throw to beat us. Now, he can still beat you that way. Also, good luck, because we've seen so many times this season, you can have one guy, two guys, three guys, have him completely hemmed in, and then he's escaping and he's running or he's throwing it. So it's tough. And that gives South Carolina such an advantage in this game. We're talking about Rocket Sanders and his absence. We can talk about the backs, which we have, but also Lenore Sellers can be such an asset in the run game with designed runs as well, whether it's zone read or let's go run power, let's go run counter. There were times in the back half of the season, Wes, where the play call was literally, let's snap the ball to Lenoris and let's block for him and let him run. We saw that A&M, Clemson. There were key points in that game where they said, this is what we're running, and they did it, and the other team had a really hard time stopping it. So, he's a great player, and it really gives opposing defenses a lot of problems. You can have a great play call on. You can even execute your play call pretty well up until the end, and then he can just wreck your game plan.
Yeah, I almost think that the best way to beat South Carolina or to try to slow them down, you almost have to be a little bit more conservative on defense and play a lot of zone. Try to keep everything in front. Let those defenders keep all eyes on the quarterback, and just hope that as Carolina dinks and dunks down the field that you can get a stop or a turnover along the way. You almost have. If I was a defense coordinator, I'm playing almost bend but don't break against these guys, even though fans hate that. When you heat Sellers up and try to blitz him, if you don't get there, you're asking for it. So I think if you're an opponent at this point, you kind of have to pick your battles in terms of when you're going to be aggressive and when you're going to blitz him and try to keep them off balance in terms of what the expectation is from that defense, which brings us to another point. Shula's first game as play caller for Carolina. I think that is a fascinating storyline in terms of, again, going back to like we were talking about with the running backs, an opportunity to learn something about not just this year's team, but next year's team as well. And I want to hit that. But first, Chris, let's tell everybody about our friend Andy Luedecke from My Perfect Franchise, myperfectfranchise.net. Contact Andy today, 404-973-9901, or just shoot him an email, andy@myperfectfranchise.net. Andy is the owner of My Perfect Franchise, but he also has franchises of his own. So he is in it himself. He knows exactly what it's like to own a business. And Andy wants to help you sort of either start a side business or if you want to go completely all in into business ownership. So what he does as a consultant is he's going to take your skill set, your sort of time you have, what you're looking for, and he is going to match you with other businesses that also are looking for people just like you. So hit up Andy today, and he's going to walk you through what it is like to own a business yourself. 404-973-9901. Appreciate Andy being a sponsor here, not just on our show, but several shows throughout the On3 network. Chris, what do we learn about Shula tomorrow, if anything?
Here's where my head immediately goes. You do have a longer than usual window from the regular season finale to the bowl game, right? Like we talk about this a lot. When you're going from, game 6 to game 7, just to pick a couple random games in the middle of the season, your prep for that week, Wes, is what, 3 practices, basically? You don't have time to reinvent the wheel and install a bunch of new stuff. During the bowl season, you have a little bit more time. You can tweak a little bit more. You can install a little bit more. But you don't see wholesale changes. And from everything that we've heard publicly and privately, you don't expect Shula to come in and reinvent the wheel. He said this a lot. He said this during his opening press conference back in Columbia when it was announced officially that he was getting the job. His job when he was basically the quarterback's coach was to be an extension of Dowell Loggins. And he has had some comments since then that indicate like, we want to take what was working and just continue it and expand on it. Is he going to have some of his own ideas? Sure. I mean, some of his ideas were probably brought into this offense when he got on staff. I think Lenore Sellers said it well yesterday on Sunday, Wes. It's not like this is Mike Shula's first time calling plays. Like, he's been an OC. He's got that experience. He has his own ideas. And so you look at the fact that he's worked with Cam Newton, like he's going to bring in quarterback run game elements. He's going to know how to work with a quarterback like that. I just think in the bowl game, will we see some new stuff where, I haven't seen that play yet this year? Probably. But you also aren't going to go in expecting, hey, we're going to see this completely different style of offense, because what we saw down the stretch from South Carolina largely was working, right? And it was producing. I think we'll have more of Shula's stamp on this offense probably in 2025 than in this bowl game, but there may be some tweaks and some differences going into this one too.
Yeah, and even as he puts his stamp on it in 2025, Chris, you got to kind of think from a almost global standpoint. It's still going to be pretty similar, I would think. Like that, you're not keeping Shula if the plan is just to completely scrap the offense. Like one of the huge advantages to keeping him, I think, was that you don't have to have Sellers completely learn new offense, new scheme, new terminology, new everything. Everybody in that building is comfortable with each other. And most importantly, your quarterback is comfortable with what you're doing. And I think when we have a guy like Sellers, you just got to do everything you can to empower him to go be who he is. And, in college football, you only get these windows ever so often where you have a guy like Sellers. So I think you got to try to take advantage of it any way that you possibly can. And by keeping someone who's going to run a similar scheme, run the same scheme potentially just with tweaks, but similar terminology and all those things, it definitely makes sense. I'll be curious if some of what we see tomorrow, frankly, may be what you talked about there at the beginning, Chris. It's just a bowl game. Like there may be more. You always see a couple trick plays in a bowl game. You always see some wrinkles in a bowl game. One, because that's just what offensive coaches love to do anyway. So it lets them be creative. It keeps the players involved a little bit in practice, keeps them dialed in. Players love the trick plays. So you're probably going to see some stuff you haven't seen. But I would also say it's probably going to be pretty similar to what we've seen from this offense throughout the year. I'm trying to make sure we hit everything before we get out of here. I was making some notes as I watched. We've hit on a lot of this already. Turnovers. Their offense, not to bounce around too much, but Illinois' offense is like, you look at Brett Bielema. I remember the last offense that I saw him running when Carolina was facing Arkansas back in the day, and it was just old school. Like, there's some I formation. I think Carolina beat the heck out of that team, but he has come forward into the new century in terms of offense. This is what you see from everybody these days: spread offense, get the ball out quick. Little tempo here and there, but I always put teams in categories, Chris. You're either a tempo team or you're a pre-snap motion or pre-snap movement team. Illinois goes a little bit more towards pre-snap movement and motion and shifts and stuff like that. So they'll shift around quite a bit before they snap the ball. That caught my attention a little bit. We talked about turnovers. Somebody mentioned J.R. Johnson in the chat there. Do you think there'll be some players in this game, Chris, that are not affected by opt-outs, but that we see a little bit more of just because it is a little bit of a showcase for next year? Like, do you rotate a J.R. Johnson in there a little bit more just to get him that experience? Do you rotate a Monkel Goodwine in there a little bit more to get him that experience? In the games themselves, we didn't see JR play a ton on defense. It was mostly special teams. I wonder maybe if you don't use this opportunity to get some of those guys in there.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's kind of similar, Wes, to me at the running back position that we were talking about earlier. If we know anything about Shane Beamer and the way that he and the rest of this team, the way that they're approaching this game, they're not going into this game saying, this is a showcase. This is a glorified spring game. They want to come out and win and get that 10th win. It's very important to everybody. So I think above all else, they're going into this game saying, what do we have to do to win? And if that's riding the seniors, like you talked about linebacker. I mean, Carolina is losing definitely some. Do we say probably all? Bam Martin Scott now a little bit. We'll see what happens there. But as of right now, unless something changes, they're going to lose all those seniors, 3 seniors at linebacker. It's D Knight's last game. It's Debo's last game. Right now, it is Bam's last game. And those have been your guys. So I kind of, Wes, lean towards, you'd love to give JR and maybe some guys at some other positions some run if you can. But I think you go into it saying what gives us the best shot to win this game and pick up the 10th win. And that's kind of where my head is at on it.
We haven't talked any hardly transfer portal. Michael asked, and I do think this is worth, before we get into our final predictions here, worth hitting on for a moment. It's a little bit of a misnomer, which is just, it always happens in the way things are phrased in recruiting, like dead period. We always talk about how dead period is a complete misnomer. All a dead period means is you can't have visits on or off campus. You can still talk to guys, but a lot of times if people just follow recruiting casually, you hear dead period, you think, oh, that means you can't be recruiting right now. Not the case at all. Michael asked about the transfer portal closing. Technically, the transfer portal closed at the end of the 28th, technically. But that's really a misnomer as well. For one, in terms of Carolina players and guys who, might still want to enter the portal. They've done a really good job, Carolina has, of keeping the guys they wanted to keep. But really, the date you have to remember in terms of that is 5 days, 5 full days. So starting the next day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the 5th, the end of that day, that's the real number for South Carolina. So for any bowl team, take the bowl game, go into the next day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the end of that day. And then even then, Chris, that team's administration has 48 hours in order to actually have put the player's name, who is an entry at that point, but actually do the technical, logistical parts of doing it. Mm-hmm. So then you can add maybe 2 days on there. And on top of that, graduates can always enter at any point.
Yep.
And then on top of that, and to Michael's point here, Michael said, portal is closed. How do you think we did? The portal is closed for non-bowl teams basically right now. And there's even a few bowl teams that would have had late bowl games that I guess technically probably still are in their window. But if a player is already in the portal, they do not have to have decided by now.
That's right.
So that's an important aspect of this to note as well.
Yeah, you're really only going to be limited in terms of making an actual decision by just like the academic calendar at wherever you're looking at going. There's certain day classes are going to start, certain day that you're going to have to be in class. That's going to be, for most places, sometime in the early, middle part of January, right? So there's not finality to anything in the portal right now. You can look at who South Carolina's got so far, and you can make a judgment on that. But this thing is far from over, both in terms of players jumping in the portal or guys that are already in making decisions. There are tons of guys still available across the country in the portal.
Yeah, so we'll see where that ends. We probably this is not the show for it. We probably do need to do a show soon and dive a little bit more into some of the recent portal pickups, but want to kind of keep this one focused on the game itself and what to look for there. Let's do keys and let's do a winner, Chris. What is your top key to a South Carolina win over Illinois?
Let me give one on each side of the ball. And I would say, Wes, off defensively for South Carolina, it's to contain Luke Altmyer. We talked about this a lot earlier. He's a guy that can he can throw the ball down the field. He can make the off-schedule type of plays where, to a lesser degree of Lenora Sellers, you got to make sure if you got an opportunity to get him on the ground that you do it, because he can make you pay. We talked earlier about how Illinois has struggled when Altmyer's, not been careful with the football, which is kind of rare-ish, right? From an interception standpoint, he's only thrown 5. Can you get him into some situations where he tries to force a ball? Can South Carolina's pass rush cause some negative plays? Again, Illinois against Penn State gave up 7 sacks. They've had some problems with that in a few of the games that were either close or losses this year. So affect Luke Altmaier. He's the straw that stirs the drink. That's the key defensively. And then offensively, Wes, I think it's established the run game, and that's with Lenore Sellers' design run. I think that's Lenore Sellers extending plays for you. And it's South Carolina's stable of backs without Rocket Sanders. Can they have some success on the ground to kind of make it a little bit less pressure in the passing game where Illinois, has been at times pretty good. Illinois has shown some vulnerabilities, Wes, as you pointed out, facing mobile quarterbacks. Sellers is going to be their biggest challenge yet. So those are my keys. Do you want my prediction now, or you want just the keys?
Just keys for now.
Those are my keys.
All right. Yeah, we'll get to predictions here in a moment. We talk about it a lot, Chris, how your keys can be the same for most games. Like it's always particular things, but for whatever reason, because of the way a team's makeup is, you maybe focus a little bit more on an area against a particular team. And so for me, this game's version of that is red zone is big no matter who you play, right? Like you always talk, run the football, win the turnover battle, force field goals, et cetera, et cetera. Not a lot, as I said earlier, just stands out statistically about this Illinois team. But as I dove into their red zone percentages, so Illinois is one of the worst teams in the Big Ten at allowing scores defensively when they're in the red zone, but are a good bit better, 8th among 18 teams at touchdowns allowed in the red zone. So they're giving up points in the red zone, but a lot of times they're forcing field goals is what that means. On the other side, Illinois offensively, one of the best in the Big Ten, 89% of the time, this is 3rd in the Big Ten, 89% of the time they score if they're in the red zone. However, their touchdown percentage is 10th among the 18 teams, 61% of the time. So what do all those numbers mean? Offensively, if Illinois gets in the red zone, they usually score, but they're probably kicking field goals more often than they want to. And on the other side, defensively, if you get in the red zone, so against Illinois' defense, if your offense gets in the red zone, most of the time you're scoring, but they're forcing a lot of field goals themselves. So who's scoring touchdowns in this game? Who's kicking field goals? It's always a factor, but that's been a pretty big factor for them this year throughout the year. So score those touchdowns as opposed to kicking those field goals down there, which ultimately a lot of times goes back to Chris's thing, in my opinion. Can you run the football? Teams that can run the football tend to do pretty well in the red zone. And I think that's an area where Carolina, with the run threat of Lenore Sellers, with a team that that has at times struggled a little bit, like we said, to stop the QB run, does that factor in? And so I think Carolina can take advantage of that, but also if they don't, maybe that's something that limits your overall scoring ability, because I do think they can move the football against this team. See, a couple other guys you may want to know, just kind of checking the boxes here. Zachary Franklin for Illinois, Chris, is the wide receiver for them that is probably going to have to take on a bigger workload with Pat Bryant, who opted out for them. Both of their running backs, in my opinion, Aiden Loudery, I think I just butchered his name. Again, I was not very familiar with Illinois until I dove into them this past week. And then Josh McCray. McCray, a bigger back, Aiden more of like a kind of a scat back, make you miss, catch the football out of the backfield. A pretty good player, man. Like, he's a guy you don't want to give space to. If you give him space, he can create those big play opportunities. So this will be a decent sized test for this South Carolina defense, in my opinion, in that they do not have Pat Bryant, but they do have some other weapons that maybe aren't national level guys, but are just pretty good players. Like, you're not 9-3 in the Big Ten without having some pretty good players throughout.
Yeah, McCray, has the highest number of carries on the team at 104, but Aiden Laffery, or however you say his name, 522 yards. He's got the most yardage. And they also have a third back that has 67 carries in Caden Fegan, who has 3 touchdowns this season. So they do have, you're talking about how this team was balanced, Wes. When you kind of look, just that's a good word for this team just in general. They're pretty balanced in the run game too. Now, Zachary Franklin, 51 catches, right behind Pat Bryant's 54. But Pat Bryant, as we said earlier, their biggest play guy, 10 touchdowns, 18 yards a reception. So that shows you big plays, just short of 1,000 yards this season, has a 64-yard long. Like, he's their most explosive guy. So you're coming into this game with Bryant out. You're circling Franklin. You're knowing that their next highest receiver is Colin Dixon with 17 catches. So you're really focused on Franklin. And then you know that any of these backs that they put in the game are more than capable. And, of course, it starts with Luke Altmaier, as we talked about.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Chris, final prediction, man. What you got? I think we're both going Gamecocks. What's your score?
I am going Gamecocks. I haven't looked, Wes. At one point, South Carolina was kind of hovering around that averaging 30 points a game mark. I don't know where they're at right now, to be honest with you. But that is the number that popped in my head, is Carolina puts up 30. I've got Carolina 30, Illinois 20, 10-point margin for South Carolina. They do get a double-digit win, and they get double-digit wins in 2024 by closing this one out.
Yeah, that's right on the line right now too. I think I know it was 11 or so before. I think last I saw it was maybe 10. So Vegas kind of agrees with you there. I've got a little bit tighter but similar score. I've got 27-20. I think Carolina will move the ball. I think the overall total will maybe be a little bit limited by sometimes in bowl games. If you have a couple turnovers that will kind of take away those scoring opportunities. We've seen Carolina on offense at times shoot themselves in the foot a little bit in terms of turnovers. So I think will be a typical bowl game where you're going to see a little bit of sloppy play here or there. But I do think South Carolina, the better football team, and I think guys are highly motivated. Like, this is a group that it appears, Chris, has had fun this week. Don't get me wrong. Like, it hasn't been just this is all business. You're not allowed to go have fun at the bowl game. They've had a lot of fun this week, but I think unlike Florida State last year, who just took their ball and went home after not making the college football playoff, most of the guys on this South Carolina team with just 2 opt-outs, most of the guys wanted to use this as an opportunity to spend one last week together, play one last game together, get that 10th win, which, as you mentioned, in Carolina history, there aren't many of these. So this is a great opportunity for this team. I think they'll play well. And something we're going to say a lot at the end of shows next year, if you have Lenora Sellers, you have a chance. And even though Illinois has a great quarterback in his own right, I'm taking 16 pretty much every time. So I got South Carolina 27, Illinois 20, and what I think will be an entertaining football game with 2 just very motivated teams. And this is what bowl season should be about. Like, Chris, as we close it out, this game has a little bit of an old school bowl feel to me. Citrus Bowl still matters. Yeah, you got a corporate sponsor tacked onto this thing, and you've got a couple of opt-outs, a couple of major players missing, as we've talked about all show. But for the most part, this feels like the bowls of Christmas past, where it kind of mattered, and people want to watch these 2 teams play, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not a no offense to other bowl. It's not a lawnmower bowl or whatever. You know, one of the ones that just again glorified spring game. This is one that matters. This is a game, Wes, where if you're not in the college football playoff, which South Carolina would love to be there, obviously, you look at it and realize that the Citrus Bowl they pick right. This isn't the SEC office saying you're going here, you're going here. They got their first pick of the non-college football playoff teams in the SEC, and they looked at a bunch of the teams, including Alabama, and they said, we're taking the Gamecocks. And so that means something, and the game means something as well.
Yeah, they picked you over Alabama. That's enough said. So, all right, before we get out of here, let me tell you about our friends at Prize Picks. Use code GC, play $5, get $50 instantly. Prize Pick is daily fantasy made easy. Join the action, run your game. Makes it easy to get real money on sports and players you love. Pick more or less on 2 or more players in any sport to win up to 1,000 times your entry fee. It's that simple. Craft your winning lineup. Cash out fast. Join a community that's winning every day. Turn your sports knowledge into cash with our friends over at Prize Picks. Jack's been telling you about them all season long, all year long. So y'all know the drill. Just go to the App Store, whatever phone you have, type in Prize Picks or head on over to prizepicks.com. You see the code right there for a little special action for you. All right, y'all. I think I'm out. Chris, you good, man? We're just going to go see what happens, right?
Yep, we'll see what happens. Should be fun.
Yep. Thank y'all for joining. Great to see some of the names we always see there in the chat. Good to be back on here. We'll be back on soon to talk about what happened in the game and talk a little transfer portal as well. For Chris, I am Wes. We are out, and we'll see y'all soon.